Welcome to Hardly, where each book is distilled into a chronological story, offering you a special journey in just minutes. Today, we study together Franklin D. Roosevelt's The Fireside Chats. Radio addresses to the American people in which we probe into how leadership can transform national crises into opportunities for unity and recovery by connecting deeply with the people. Franklin D. Roosevelt, known as Little Roosevelt, was the 32nd President of the United States and the only president in American history to serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Don't go away. Hardly, the editor, will be right back with the story. In the depths of the Great Depression, the American people were gripped by uncertainty and fear. Banks were failing, unemployment soared, and families across the country faced dire economic hardship. It was during this tumultuous time, in March 1933, that Franklin D. Roosevelt, newly inaugurated as president, turned to a simple yet powerful medium: the radio. He delivered his first fireside chat, addressing a nation eager for hope. Roosevelt spoke directly to the people, not with the formal, detached tone of a politician, but with the warmth of a neighbor sitting by the fire. His calm, reassuring voice explained the banking crisis in terms that anyone could understand. "I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking," he began. By breaking down the complex financial turmoil, he reassured Americans that their government was acting swiftly to protect their deposits. "It is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress," he declared, helping to rebuild public trust in the financial system. As the New Deal unfolded throughout 1933 and 1934, Roosevelt's fireside chats became a regular event, drawing millions of listeners. He outlined sweeping reforms aimed at reviving the economy, banking legislation, public works programs, and agricultural support. His leadership during this time was not just about implementing policies, it was about making people believe in the power of collective action. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Public Works Administration, PWA, put Americans back to work, rebuilding the nation's infrastructure and restoring a sense of dignity to those who had lost everything. Through these programs, Roosevelt not only attacked the symptoms of the Depression, but also addressed its root causes. In his second fireside chat on May 7, 1933, he gave an update on the nation's recovery, noting that while the journey was long, progress was being made. His emphasis was always on cooperation. The success of our whole great national program depends, of course, upon the cooperation of the public. He continually reinforced the idea that the American people had a role to play in their own recovery, creating a sense of shared responsibility and hope for the future. By 1934, the effects of the New Deal were beginning to take hold. Americans were slowly regaining faith in their government and economy. However, as Roosevelt's administration focused on recovery at home, the growing instability in Europe hinted at greater challenges to come. Perspective Roosevelt's use of the fireside chats during this period was groundbreaking in that it made the president's voice an intimate part of American homes. He transformed the role of the government, making it an active participant in everyday life. Through his programs, he restored confidence not only in the financial system, but in the very idea of American democracy. As the nation began to heal, Roosevelt would soon face a new external threat: the rising specter of global conflict. The need to prepare the country for the possibility of war would come to dominate his leadership in the years that followed, laying the groundwork for the next phase of his presidency. As the world began to unravel in the late 1930s, Franklin D. Roosevelt found himself steering America through a delicate balancing act. The nation was still recovering from the Great Depression, but the growing storm of World War II in Europe threatened global stability. By 1935, Roosevelt's fireside chats began shifting focus from domestic recovery to international danger, urging Americans to remain vigilant. his tone evolved from one of economic reassurance to one of cautious preparedness, as he saw the rise of fascism in Europe and the increasing militarization of Japan. In his speeches, Roosevelt laid out his vision of a nation ready to defend itself, but still striving to avoid direct involvement in the war. He knew that many Americans were deeply isolationist, weary from the bloodshed of World War I and hesitant to be drawn into another global conflict. But as Germany and Japan grew more aggressive, Roosevelt realized the need to prepare the American people for the possibility of war. In 1939, as the war broke out in Europe, Roosevelt addressed the nation again, reminding them of the fragile peace they enjoyed. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declared, emphasizing the need to support allies like Britain and France while remaining outside the fighting for as long as possible. He sought to increase military production and passed the Neutrality Acts, allowing the sale of arms to nations at war, all while maintaining America's official stance of non-intervention. Roosevelt's strategy of preparedness culminated in the establishment of the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, the first peacetime draft in US history. It was a bold move, and one that faced significant opposition from those who still believed in America's distance from European affairs. Yet, Roosevelt understood that a well-prepared nation would be in a far better position to protect itself if and when the war reached its shores. In December 1940, as the threat of conflict loomed ever closer, Roosevelt began to speak openly about the necessity of preparing for a global crisis. "We look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms," he said, foreshadowing the ideological battle that would dominate the coming years. His references to freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear signaled that America's involvement would eventually go beyond national interests to defending these global ideals. Perspective Roosevelt's handling of the late 1930s and early 1940s was characterized by his careful yet determined effort to prepare the nation for a conflict many hoped to avoid. He understood that the isolationist tendencies of his people had to be respected, but not at the expense of national security. His approach laid the foundation for a unified America that would be ready when war eventually came. As the war in Europe intensified, Roosevelt's speeches grew more urgent. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 would force the nation into World War II, marking the beginning of a new chapter, one in which Roosevelt would lead America as a global power, fighting not only for its own survival, but for the freedom of the world. The next phase of his leadership would define both his presidency and the course of history. In the early hours of December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the American public and thrust the nation into World War II. Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had spent years preparing the country for this moment, now faced the monumental task of leading the United States through the greatest conflict in human history. The following day, he addressed the nation, delivering his famous Day of Infamy speech, declaring war on Japan. "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy," Roosevelt began, galvanizing the country for the long and difficult road ahead. As American troops mobilized, Roosevelt used his fireside chats to maintain a direct connection with the people. He explained the nation's evolving role in the global conflict, framing the war as a battle for democracy against the forces of totalitarianism. By 1942, the US had entered into an alliance with Britain, the Soviet Union, and other Allied powers. Roosevelt reassured Americans that victory was possible, but he did not shy away from the sacrifices required. He spoke of rationing, war bonds, and the need for unity on the home front. "We will have to be tough with ourselves," he said, reminding citizens that the fight for freedom came with personal costs. As Allied forces gained ground in Europe and the Pacific, Roosevelt's addresses became more hopeful. In 1943, he celebrated key victories, such as the defeat of Axis forces in North Africa and the successful invasions of Sicily and Italy. Yet, he never allowed complacency to set in. He constantly reminded the public that the war was far from over and that the struggle for peace would extend beyond the battlefield. "Our objectives are clear: total victory and lasting peace," he asserted, framing the fight as one not just for military success, but for a new world order founded on democratic ideals. Roosevelt also used these years to lay the groundwork for the post-war world. In 1944, as the war turned decisively in favor of the Allies, he spoke of the future, a world where international cooperation could prevent future conflicts. He was instrumental in envisioning the United Nations, a body that would ensure that peace, once won, could be maintained. His final fireside chats of this period were marked by a tone of cautious optimism. He spoke of a world that, while scarred by war, could emerge stronger and more united. Perspective Roosevelt's wartime leadership was not just about guiding military strategy. It was about inspiring a nation to believe in its purpose. He framed the conflict as a moral crusade, one in which the values of democracy, freedom, and human rights were at stake. His ability to communicate these ideals helped maintain American resolve through the darkest days of the war, and his vision for the post-war world laid the foundation for the international order that would follow. With victory in sight by 1944, Roosevelt began preparing the country for its new role as a global leader. The sacrifices made during the war were immense, but so too was the potential for lasting peace. As the Allies moved toward victory, Roosevelt's legacy was cemented as not only a war leader, but as the architect of a new democratic world order. Through his fireside chats, Roosevelt used radio broadcasts to speak directly to the American people, turning complex crises like the Great Depression and World War II into understandable, personal stories. His calm, empathetic voice reassured citizens, explained government actions, and called for collective responsibility. By addressing both economic struggles and wartime fears, Roosevelt built a bridge between the government and the public. His ability to inspire confidence and unity through communication truly reshaped history, demonstrating that effective leadership starts with connection and trust. As the editor of Hardly, through learning from Roosevelt's steadfast resolve and visionary leadership, we might see a future where crises are met not with retreat, but with the courage to build institutions that secure long-term peace and cooperation. Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats exemplified how leadership can transform national crises into opportunities for unity and recovery by deeply connecting with the people. His ability to blend empathy with decisive action made him a powerful communicator, whether navigating the Great Depression or leading America through World War II. One particularly striking moment occurred during a chat in 1942 when Roosevelt addressed the logistical challenges of global war. He shared a story about the critical Battle of the Atlantic, where American and Allied forces struggled against German U-boats. Roosevelt didn't just speak about military strategies. He personalized it by explaining the challenges of getting food, munitions, and supplies safely across the Atlantic to the troops. "Every time one of these supply ships makes it through," he said, "it's a victory for the men fighting on the front lines." His description of the dangerous seas and how ordinary workers in shipyards and factories contributed to these vital missions made the war feel personal to Americans at home. This vivid storytelling connected the war effort directly to listeners' lives, emphasizing their crucial role in the fight for freedom. Roosevelt's ability to unite the public through moments of shared sacrifice and understanding marked his presidency. As a leader, he not only steered the nation through the most difficult of times, but also helped Americans see their collective strength. His leadership reminds us that even in the darkest hours, effective communication can bind a nation together and transform challenges into triumphs.